Welcome back to a continuation of Conversations with Chrissy. So proud to have some of our former MVA administrators joining us again to share their story and their history with the MVA in the state of Maryland. Let's go to the federal mandates because it's been referenced a few times. John jumped in there with Real ID, and I know Milt, Real ID, you talked about when you were hired, right? I mean, that was from the beginning of your MVA time, right? So let's talk a little bit about Real ID.
Hijackers got IDs and things, and they shouldn't have been able to get them. That kind of set everything in motion.
That's right. It fundamentally changed the nature of identity management for motor vehicle agencies and what we had to do to vet our customers. We often talk about in these, Ann, I mean, these are things that motor vehicle agencies were talking about even before that, about what needed to be done. But after 9/11, I think it really crystallized in a different way. And then, of course, the federal mandate, which created more burdens for states, and still working towards a implementation date, which has been pushed out again. So that one's really something that spanned many administrator terms.
Well, it does. It does. I mean, we can all kind of remember the day. Where were we? I was getting ready for interviews. I was actually just interviewing somebody at Bill Long's office at the time when we all walked out and saw the towers come down. I was very glad Milt came after we rescheduled. But I think in truth, that shifted. Well, MVA all along had been safety and service. It really shifted us more clearly into security. It wasn't that, just as Marshall described at the outset, we didn't already understand what an important data and privacy role we held in the systems, because the MVA has the largest, if not the second largest, perhaps next to tax database in the state, in the jurisdiction. But that shift into identity security was pretty profound, just as Milt described, to learn that some of the hijackers had credentials from Maryland and a couple other states. I mean, it was devastating, frankly, and we really worked very hard to improve the integrity of that process and license and ensure. I mean, you have built on it, but it's something states are still talking about today to implement. The Real ID Act still, just about every jurisdiction has Real ID. Every jurisdiction does have Real ID. Some have 100% adoption. The impact on service times, the impact on state privilege in terms of how you do your own process. All of those things have profoundly impact how each of the state motor vehicle administrations work. But really to see, I mean, I'm really more curious to see how Milt and John and you sort of carried this out. I think you probably have a clearer recollection of how we truly implemented, because the first couple of years after 9/11, we couldn't get word one out of the federal government, just that there was a mandate. President Bush had a mandate. We had this requirement. The states had already come together and built what would be the requirements of a standardized driver's license. We called it drivers, and the concept of being able to exchange data to ensure that you couldn't have more than one license at any one time. But it was really Congress built on that. But we couldn't get the feds to decide on anything, and yet we were still beholden to a revised process. So I'm excited now to hear from Milt.
The big thing that a lot of people didn't realize was the procurement effort around it was huge.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And that was one of our biggest challenges, not just getting the right ID, but the procurement piece. And it was fortunate that John had a strong background in procurement, and I had worked there and learned from the ground up, so we were ready to do it. And then it took money too. I mean, that it wasn't just the procurement effort. It was actually being able to afford to do it too, and having it in the budget, because no one really understood that but us.
Right. I think one of the interesting things when I was witnessing the impact of Real ID in the motor vehicle community was the similarities with an earlier federal mandate, commercial driver licensing. And commercial driver licensing presented the same challenges with one big exception. And most of the motor vehicle agencies were not focused on policy. At the time the commercial driver license requirement came in 1986, there were only 10 states in the country, in the United States or Canada, 10 states or provinces that had a classified driver's system that actually had a driver license for a motorcyclist or for a truck driver. Fortunately, Maryland was one of those. Credit for that goes way before my time. Maryland, I felt, has always been very, very advanced in driver licensing policy. But CDL forced the community of motor vehicle administrators to focus on the policy side and to focus on the impact of policy decisions and practices in one jurisdiction and how they affect another. The feds also were absent after they passed the law, and we learned a lot about trying to figure out how to participate in a federal vacuum in a way that influenced the final outcome, as was the case in Real ID.
Yeah.
But it also energized the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. The early days of the AAMVA, people would get together and talk about process. What kind of paper do you print titles on? Should you have a picture on your driver's license? That sort of thing. The organization as a whole was driven toward a higher level of professionalism through the CDL program, where they had to think about policy and AAMVA's role in helping the states develop uniform policy, states and provinces. And I think that led into a position where, in some sense, it was a little bit easier. Had Real ID come without CDL, I think it would have been a disaster.
That's a great point. And even our all driver system today builds on that. And AMBA is such an important way that we are able to communicate with other states electronically and get these assurances. John, on Real ID, I think the first week that I started, you had created that Real ID task force, and it really was about trying to bring everybody together, right? And make sure from our elected leaders to our fellow government agencies that we're all on the same page, because it was such a big policy shift moving forward.
It was, the Federal Real ID Act definitively was a very unique policy shift for all the state DMVs, motor vehicle agencies. And when you think about it, the United States Congress was very strategic in how they crafted this piece of legislation. It's technically a federal mandate. But the way they crafted this legislation is that, because it's with recognition that issuing driver licenses is delegated to the states.
That's right.
Okay, it's an authority of the state, not under federal jurisdiction. And so the way they crafted this piece of legislation, passing the Real ID Act of 2005, was that they disallowed state-issued driver license. If you want to use a state-issued ID to enter a federal facility or to board a commercial aircraft or to enter a nuclear power plant, and it's not Real ID compliant, you could not do so, okay? Now, therefore, it doesn't really technically prohibit the state from not complying with federal Real ID. So when the Real ID Act passed in 2005 by Congress, there was indeed an uproar by a lot of the state jurisdictions. One was unfunded because of because it was really unknown what we needed to do at the time. It was passed in 2005, and two, there was this, there were state agencies and state governments that believed that the feds were crossing the line with regard to this mandate. But we basically, as soon as the Federal Real ID passed, we formed the internal task force to begin to collect information on what's going to be required. And we had to really wait for the feds who turned this over to the newly created agency called the Department of Homeland Security to promulgate the regulations. Okay?
And it took years for them
and
to become
they didn't promulgate
final,
the regulations until 3 years later, in 2008. 3 years after the Federal Real ID Act passed. And then even after they promulgated regulations, they didn't really know how to enforce it. Okay, so as in a long story short, even to this day, I guess they're going to start the full enforcement actions in 2025, I believe.
That's
right.
That's right.
So it took that long 20 years from the passage of an act of the United States Congress for full enforcement actions to take place to this day.
Well, but the real impact of that was, I mean, to Marshall's point, the jurisdictions, the community of states within AMBIT was less so for the Canadian jurisdictions, came together and continued to evolve what they'd already begun, which is understanding that to have the most secure driver's license and most secure data, we need to have some standards of interoperability to ensure that those credentials couldn't be held by more than one, one person couldn't have more than one credential, but depending on what state they were in at any given time. That's right. We wanted to be sure they weren't falling through the cracks on fraud, identity fraud, as well as on safety. And the feds did ultimately bring money into the game through FEMA to implement and structure a pilot. And Chrissy Nizer, Maryland was really the lead in helping bring that concept together and actually create the foundation for what now is known as the state-to-state service. Because the regulation for from the Department of Homeland Security would only be effective as long as something was implemented. You can say states can't issue a real ID to a person if there's already one in another state, but if you can't carry that out through a system, through a process much like CIDLIS, Commercial Driver License Information System, it's to no avail. And really, Chrissy, you had such a key role in that for Maryland and for the community across the country. So.
Only thanks to John for saying, hey, we need you to represent Maryland on this group. And so
is that really where it started?
It really is where it started. I remember some of the representatives came and met with us, and John saw the vision of it makes sense to come together as the states and set the stage for this, as opposed to being told by the federal government, this is what you need to do. And so buying into that concept, we helped put together the requirements and said to the federal government, doesn't this make sense? So that they would move in that direction. But yeah, it's all thanks to John. And really every component of what we do as a motor vehicle agency was impacted. To change the law, we had to change the actual physical card that was issued, the procurement piece that Milt referenced. We had to change our security processes, all of our facilities, what they look like from a security. Our employees had to go through training and background checks. As you think about, there was not a stone unturned when it comes to motor vehicle business during that time. So it was incredibly challenging in terms of how do you make sure you meet the federal requirements, which aren't quite finalized, but at the same time, bring your employees along with it because they're struggling to keep up with these new mandates and these new requirements.
It's important to note that one of the key challenges in implementation of the Federal Real ID Act for our state in particular was convincing our elected officials that was the right thing to do. And you might recall Chrissy and Milt, both of you, because I keenly recall one particular meeting where with former Secretary John Picari and I went to meet with Governor O'Malley, one-on-one, to outline the options that we had as a state entity to comply with Federal Real ID Act standards once the DHS regulations were promulgated. And we outlined three clear options, One, you could do nothing, not comply.
Which some states did
not
for
comply,
a while,
which is an option, but not an attractive option, but it was still an option, And another option was to fully comply Federal Real ID based on the regulations they promulgated regarding requiring legal presence, etc. But we recommended ultimately the option of implementing a two-tier process. The two-tier process, because as you might recall, Milt and Chrissy, one of the major challenges that we had was, and this was actually highlighted by Lou Dobbs, I believe, on CNN. In one particular news segment, he kept talking on the nightly news that Maryland was a weak link.
That's right.
Because we did not have a legal presence requirement. And lo and behold, as soon as that aired, what were we seeing, Milt? We were seeing people lined up at our branch offices around the corner.
Wow.
They were coming from all the other state jurisdictions because they saw Maryland as a pass-through for a driver license.
Was Milt your deputy at that time? Milt, were you deputy administrator?
He was.
Or leading the field. I mean, how did you guys manage that? Because you did. You were overwhelmed with, you had folks sitting along the floors around the...
We spent a lot of time managing those long lines and those people showing up.
Fraud was out the door.
Talk about fraud a little bit. I mean, I know that's something, Milt, that you really focused on in terms of how do you ensure the integrity of the product and make sure people aren't being taken advantage of, frankly.
And quite honestly, that's when we actually did expand our investigative unit and got more people working on it.
And I know you helped build the fraudulent document recognition program, which we've built on today, but you're really instrumental in that.
So, I mean, that took a lot of effort. And I think fortunately, I wasn't the one that actually, I mean, Chrissy, you know, you had a lot to do with that and helping us with, you know, all the work there, not to mention someone by the name of Eric that actually, his group helped a lot with that. So.
It was definitely a team effort because it involved all aspects of the organization.
It impacted every aspect of what we used to do.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
No question.
Yeah, and it hurt us from a service standpoint for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
It truly did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The good news is Maryland's now 92% Real ID
That's right,
compliance.
that's right.
So thanks to all the good work
Yeah.
everybody
That's
did.
remarkable.
We are one, not
remarkable.
quite at 100, but one of the top states
Right.
in terms of it. But it was because the foundation
with
that
was
option.
made.
Kudos to the three of you. Maryland, even with all the delays and procurement issues and everything, was one of the first states that
Yeah.
Well,
was
that-
certified fully required.
Excellent point, Marshall.
And
Because
recertified,
and
so
to this
it's,
date, I think myself and former director of DMV and former secretary of the Delaware the DOT, Jennifer Cohen, when we see each other, we always debate who was number one. Who was the first state to comply, Delaware or Maryland?
Well, Delaware is the first state.
As far as I'm
after all.
concerned, it was Maryland.
It was
right?
Maryland.
It was
That's my
Maryland,
story, and
right.
I'm sticking
So-
to it.
Well, because actually DHS was pointing Maryland out, using Maryland as an example for all the other states that were resisting compliance with federal real ID
That's
mandate, and using Maryland as an example. Look, they were able to do it. They're coming into compliance. Why can't you?
Made you popular with your peers.
They were
didn't
not.
it?
It was
Not
not
so much.
popular.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that did make you popular, and I think this has been under Chrissy's tenure, is the introduction of Real ID by appointments. I remember when I went to get my first Real ID. I mean, I made an appointment. I was in and out in nanosecond. I mean, it was so cool.
Yeah.
And I like to go to the Annapolis branch, by the way. I like to go to Glen Burnie branch and hang out because, as I say, I think the people are amazing. But it was just, the service was astounding and professional and simple and convenient. Because it has come such a long way from the time that I stepped in following Marshall, and Marshall really introduced some of the wait time improvements. So, I mean, you guys have really done so much. It's amazing.
When John was there, and he really worked with the secretary, which was Beverly at the time, they moved the Maryland Highway Safety Office to the MVA. It made so much sense. It probably didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of other people. And that's where we really took major steps that are evident even in the state that I live in right now, that they didn't have that kind of relationship, because it drove the kind of behavior that helped us really get safety under control. Things like the distracted driving legislation that took place. I mean, we got everybody involved, law enforcement. To this day in Georgia, law enforcement is not really engaged in that. And that's why there's still so many, I think, fatalities here. Right. You know, and it is a high fatality state, but that was a major thing. Chrissy, John, you guys did a great job of making that happen. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I think citizens of Maryland really don't understand, how impactful that's been on safety. I mean, the ability to put more emphasis on the driving schools, getting law enforcement as a partner with us to work on, you know, making sure enforcement took place. When I see they have the 3-state enforcement here, I look at it sometimes and I laugh, because they do it a couple of times, but other than that, no emphasis on speeding, no emphasis on distracted driving. That's where Maryland is so far ahead of everyone.
Talk a little bit about that, John, how it came to be.
Oh, my pleasure. I've always thought that the Maryland Highway Safety Office logically belonged under the Motor Vehicle Administration. Because when you think about it, the Maryland Highway Administration's mission, mandate, and focus is on building safe highways, okay? Having the proper guardrails, having the proper drainage, so on and so forth, doing climate weather. But what really causes crashes in the state and the increase in crashes in the state data was the fact that vehicles and drivers and operators of those vehicles were the major causes of those crashes, who obviously had the focus and mission mandate to make sure that our drivers operate safely behind the wheel. It was the Motor Vehicle Administration, which is why, I strategically always constantly thought, if there was an opportune time to transition the MHSO, the Maryland Highway Safety Office, over to the MVA, I would jump at that chance. But that chance never arose because my former colleague, the State Highway Administrator, Mr. Neil Peterson, had done such an admirable job in running the MHSO, under the State Highway Administration. I just didn't think it was the proper time to propose a hostile takeover of the Maryland Highway Safety Office and have it merged under the MVA. But when Mr. Peterson, State Administrator Peterson, retired from state service from the Highway Administration, I immediately talked to Chrissy and Milt Chaffee and said, "What do you think?" And they were squarely behind the proposed idea to merge the MHSO and have it transition over to the MVA. So obviously, I had a conversation and proposed that to the former Secretary Beverly Swaim Staley. She immediately concurred. So I'm so glad that you guys want to take this on. And she obviously had a conversation with the governor. The governor concurred, and here the rest is history. MHSO was merged and transitioned over to the MVA. With that said, it sounds like an easy transition. It was a major undertaking, okay, in moving the MHSO office. First off, you got the staff of the MHSO who has a long tenure and history with the Maryland Highway Administration that didn't really necessarily want to be part of the MDA. Yeah. Okay, they believed they logically belonged under the Maryland Highway Administration. So it took some meetings with the staff at the Maryland Highway Safety Office, conversations with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration under USDOT, and we worked with the regional administrator, Elizabeth Baker, who also believed absolutely, I wish more states would move it under Motor Vehicle Administration. That just makes complete logical sense. Yeah, still exists. And hence, I'm so glad you had this crash dummy here. That's what we're about. Driver safety. So when it finally was moved over, MHSO was moved over to the MVA. We found a home for them, and I'm glad to say that the vast majority of the staff that was part of the MHSO, quickly got acclimated as part of the MVA, and they understood the driver safety focus that we were engaged in. Right. And Chrissy, you can certainly take continue to speak about, because we put the requirement under you as one of our deputy administrators of the MVA to take charge of that opportunity once it was merged with the MVA.
Well, it truly was an honor. Go ahead, Mel.
No, and I'm going to say Chrissy gave them direction they had never gotten before, and really it set them on a track to really get things accomplished. And if it wasn't for you giving them direction and setting, I can remember there was resistance. They didn't like getting direction. They thought they had all the answers, but they soon grew accustomed to it.
You're right. I think they were very independent at State Highway Administration, just an office kind of functioning on its own, which, operated fine. And so they never, I think, ran into challenges or issues. They just did their own thing. And so coming over to MVA, we said, no, you're a part of the team, just like everybody at MVA, right. And we all work together. But we were able to show, to your point, that we can incorporate your safety message into our renewal notices, and we can put the safety messages up in the branch office. There's just so many opportunities to share from an education standpoint, the driving schools. The opportunities are just countless in terms of our safety mission and what the Highway Safety Office is put in place to do. So I think it was so brilliant and fortunate from a timing standpoint that we were able to make it happen. And yeah, I think there's only been benefit to the partnership since then. But even though Highway Safety Office came fairly recently in the MVA's history, Highway Safety has been a part of what MVA has done.
Absolutely.
You know, graduate licensing system, motorcycle safety.
Right.
These are things that both of you are very engaged in and involved in. So I wonder if you could talk about that briefly, just from a, you know, this is not new in terms of our focus on highway safety and saving lives.
Well, it might go back to my comments earlier about the evolution of motor vehicle administrators writ large, evolving into policy from process. My comment to you is yes, you know, MVA was deeply involved in safety, crash reduction, road safety, safety of the driver as well, but never knew it. There was never a mission focus and an opportunity to approach it on a policy level and integrate it with other agencies and with the private sector. And so it was like everything else I think we've talked about this morning. It was an evolution of things that kind of were happening over time, both internal and external, that really has led us to where we are today. But I think I agree with John. And I never really thought about it, to be honest with you, when I was administrator. But it was a revolutionary, shall I say, cultural change to MVA to become the road safety agency of the state. And it just, it was one of the S's in the 3 S's.
That's right.
That's right.
Absolutely.
So, and I think from a stakeholder view, there was, at the time I was administrator, clearly the movement towards acknowledging that teen drivers have the highest crash and fatal crash outcomes. And it's just tragic. There's not a person in this room that hasn't spent time with a family who has lost a teen from a fatal car crash, and it is heartbreaking. And we all live really are driven to try and address that and improve it. And one of the opportunities when I was administrator was the shift to acknowledge that teen drivers needed a more graduated approach to learning to drive. And we had the benefit of some model legislation that the MVA and DOT team then modified and customized with the help of Bill Braunrod and other legislative leaders in the safety space. And it passed in the first year, which was stunning to us. We did not expect that to pass. And it includes to this day, I think, one of the only jurisdictions that requires a graduated driver licensing and driver's ed approach for any new driver, regardless of age. It doesn't stop at 18, it doesn't stop at 21. It doesn't matter if I'm a new driver at 55, I've got to go through the same driver training requirements. And the introduction of that graduated licensing law had a remarkably impactful reduction in teen driver crashes. Now, the focus of folks' driver safety messaging today is sort of that young male between age kind of 25 to 32. The crash rates are drastically high through speed and other poor driving behaviors. But graduated driver's license was, again, a team effort. It involved stakeholders. It involved advocacy. It involved Maryland MVA expertise from a policy view, and then the ability to implement. And through that implementation came, frankly, the bumper sticker rookie driver. And that was also a delegate. It was Shane Pendergrass who came up with that sticker concept. So, I mean, I guess from that we evolved into on-road testing, right? We had closed course testing when Marshall was administrator, when I became administrator, and going to an on-road testing model was highly controversial and highly tested, developed, studied through the help of Dr. Bob Raleigh, who headed up our medical advisory board as just a pioneer in that space and helped us shift to also on-road testing, all safety-focused measures that are very custom to the individual applicant, but applied uniformly across all applicants, whether it's for a new driver. And we're really, really proud of that.
Well, thank you all for each have made such a significant contribution in the highway safety area. I just want to, we're so fortunate to have such great leaders here for everybody just to learn a little bit from your perspective, what you wish you knew when you took over as administrator day one, and then what you see for the future of transportation, because things have evolved as we think about from one administration to the next. Where do you see it going? So I'd like for each of you to touch on that briefly,
Well,
Marshall.
I'm going to answer in the form of a question. How are you going to deal with licensing drivers of flying cars?
Mm-hmm.
We have a connected and automated vehicle working group that's looking at exactly those issues. Yes, it is an interesting and fascinating challenge.
And of course, and others can touch on it, but EVs.
Definitely. And what do you wish you knew when you first took over as administrator that you didn't know then? Or what advice would you give?
I think that I evolved a practice, but I didn't know it when I started. And that is about 3 years into my tenure. And I was realizing how layered the organization was and how tradition bound it was. And I started a deliberate practice of visiting the Motor Vehicle Administration offices. And I would go in, and in many cases, they had never met a motor vehicle administrator. But I started making that a kind of a fun practice and a little bit of morale building practice as well. But that's where I really learned what was going on. And there were numerous examples that I can cite where I overrode mostly process-based practices at a higher level based on what I was hearing people on the front line tell me. And I know that I passed that down as a form of advice to at least one of my successors, to make a practice of going out and visiting the Motor Vehicle Administration offices, talk to the customers, and you'll learn more than you will benefit them.
Well, that's great. Something that continues still today, so it lives on. Anne, would you like to respond to those two questions?
Well, which one? The future is now, so we are building forward for sure to serve people where they want to be served through whatever new means that enables. And I can only hope that automated vehicles help us eliminate the high degree of human-driven crashes that continue to occur, and maybe more so since the pandemic. For me, I guess it's what I wish I'd paid attention to was just listening more, talking less, leading more by setting an outcome and expectation and letting folks get there their own way. The only other thing I would say is if your gut is suggesting not to do something, if your gut feels queasy about something, don't do it.
Always
check with a colleague. There's so many instances in which in our roles you're asked by different parties to do things that just aren't right or don't feel right. They may be right in someone's eyes, but they feel like it might not be best for the whole. So there you go.
That's great. John, words of wisdom?
Well, words of wisdom. Wow. I think first, let me answer the latter question first. I think from the standpoint of where MVA is going, I think just be ready. Be ready for the fast evolution of motor vehicles. I think I shared with all of you that I drove here today, what should I say, drove part of the way in a vehicle that drives itself, and it drove itself part of the way, okay? So that's the evolution of technology in motor vehicles. One of the examples that, you are certainly aware of, and Milt's certainly aware of, is that, when we were looking at our processes and, going on-road testing, behind the wheel testing, one of our driver license examiners took it upon himself. You might recall this, okay? Back then, was one of the new technologies of one of the luxury vehicles. It could automatically parallel park, okay? And the driver license examiner took it upon himself to ask the customer to cover up that technology and turn it off, And they said, well, we got to look at this, okay, from a standpoint of evolution of technology that is available. And I'm so glad that you're taking this on through AMVA, because that technology is going to continue to evolve very quickly. AI, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, all of that is here. The technology is already here. From the standpoint of what I wish I knew when I was at the helm, I think I'll answer this from this perspective. I had the luxury of knowing Marshall, knowing Ann, knowing both of you brought aboard two fantastic team members at the MVA. So from the standpoint of having those resources at my fingertips, I was able to always bounce things off of Ann as well as Marshall, and yourself as Mel as part of the team. So I want to say that I think I was pretty much aware of what the challenges were, and I learned, obviously, every aspect of the way in running the motor vehicle administration. But you will continue to learn on the job, because you don't know what's around the corner.
It's always evolving. That's a great
Right.
segue, Milt.
Right.
Share your thoughts in terms of the role. I know you had so many roles at MBA, but taking over as administrator, it's different.
Well, the one thing about advice is I would learn as much about what has happened in the past and how things were done, so that I could make sure that I was open to the changes that came. Because when you look back over the MVA and you see what has happened, all the changes, it gives you a pretty good idea of what's going to come forward. And as far as the future is concerned, that at some point in time, the MVA will be, I guess, not licensing people, but vehicles, because the vehicles will be doing the driving, and all the people will be doing is making sure that their vehicle is licensed, and they'll just be getting IDs to fulfill the part, to let people know who they are. But at some point in time, people won't be driving the vehicles.
No, that's great. And, we think about the change going forward is so profound, but if you just think about over the last 30 years or so, the changes that you all have seen,
So,
it's pretty
Chrissy,
profound too.
why don't you answer the same two questions?
Well, it's interesting because the gentleman to my left is someone who saw in me that I could be in this role before I saw it in myself. And I remember many times as John and Milt would be in the office and I would come in to listen to their wisdom, and John would say, when you're administrator one day, this is what you need to think about. And I just kind of blew it off like, I'm never going to be administrator, but I'm going to listen because I'm going to learn from John, and he really understands things. And, then when Milt moved over to MDTA and the opportunity came up, what I'm so grateful for is I've had the opportunity to learn from such great leaders. I think the challenge that I find as administrator is stepping back and being in the moment, because so many things are hitting you all the time. So that's what I try to remind myself about, especially when you think about some of the accomplishments that have been made possible by the great decisions that were made in the past, to step back and reflect on that and make sure the team reflects on it, because it's important to me that they feel the great success that I feel that they've accomplished. And so we're still out there 7:30 in the morning. We do our branch visits, and I love that. It's one of my favorite things to do because we've got such great ideas and perspectives from them. And as with MBA, it will continue to evolve over time, and the great people that make it happen is what I love about it. So many great employees throughout the years that I've learned so much from, and certainly you as great leaders. So I thank you for all the wisdom that you've given me. It's certainly made possible, and in those difficult moments, you've been there to support. And so on behalf of all the residents of Maryland, I just want to say thank you for your service. It's been invaluable. And, when I hear things like, this is the best motor vehicle administration in the country, it's because of the work that you all did to make that happen. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to our listeners for spending some time with us. I hope you've learned just as much as I have about not only the history, but the foundation that sets for the future. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again in our next Conversations with Chrissy.